I got your mic on. You want to test it?
Get me on again.
Give me a second, I want to get it turned on here. I had this problem. This tie's short enough that the back flap of it just kind of does this, it doesn't go through the loop. All right.
Okay, you just turned it on.
I
Just turned it on. Can you tell? All right. Get that up there. And we are, let me see now, we have a number who are traveling who, because we're going out online, I won't indicate who they are, but we all know who they are who are on the road. And we have a few who may be holding off because of the weather so that they don't have to run between the drops to get inside. But we'll go ahead and get our study started now, and I'm sure we'll have a few come in just a little bit behind schedule. So let's go ahead as we start our study this morning. Let's always, as we always do when we set ourselves to a Christian task, let's go to God in prayer beforehand. Our Father who art in heaven, all powerful, all loving, all just, full of grace, full of mercy. We thank you so much for the gift which you have bestowed upon us and which you do so every day. We thank you for the gift of creation. We thank you for the plan of salvation without which the creation would never have occurred. We thank you for the love that you have for us, that you are willing to pay the price that you paid through your Son, that we might spend eternity with you in heaven through our faithful obedience. We ask that this study that we embark upon today, that we continue on today, be a study which is in accordance with your word, which is scripturally sound and which is pleasing in your sight, and which will enable us to continue our walk of faith and to confess your Son before others and to confess you. We ask that you be with us as we study today and as we take what we have learned and take it out into the world and share it with others. We thank you so much for the safety that you've afforded us as we have traveled here today. We thank you for the protections that you offer our brothers and sisters who are out there traveling as well. We know that they have other things that they're trying to conduct in businesses, the business that they're trying to conduct and travel they're trying to conduct, and we ask that you be with them as they join other congregations elsewhere. We ask that you bring them safely back to us, that we may continue to find the joy in their presence. We ask that you be with those who are dealing with health issues and with advancing age. And Father, you know who they are. We ask that you be with those who are recovering from procedures and preparing for procedures. We ask that you be with the doctors and the healthcare professionals who will seek to provide them the relief that they need from the symptoms that they have. We ask that you be with those who are suffering from this virus, and that you be with all those who are responding to this epidemic as well. And that you be with our nation, and that you heal our nation, that you restore our nation, and that the things which we do will bring other people to your word, that we may continue to protect our nation through the spiritual guidance that you give us. We ask all these things in the name of your precious Son. Amen. I'm going to do this just once to keep that alive up there. We are in Isaiah, correct? We're in Isaiah. Okay, see, here's my thing. I got markers all over this one because, as you know, we are doing our reading assignments in Isaiah as well. We're just about to wrap up Isaiah and our reading assignments, and so it's our reading assignment sort of straddles this discussion. Isaiah 27:7. Okay. So now we've talked about the things which Isaiah has talked about, those things which they're supposed to do, that rehearsal theology, that those things that they're supposed to do to continue to basically through through going through these steps again and again, reinforce in their minds the need for faithful service and for service in accordance with God's will and doing it the way God wants. Okay? But they've refused to do that, and so he's issued an indictment against them, and he's issued a judgment against them, and it's very and it's been a very unsettling thing for those who might hear Isaiah's word. And he says it's coming soon, and they need to be ready. And of course, he talks about the powers that will be destroyed and how Israel will be delivered from failure to victory in the first 5 or 6 verses we've talked to them. But what we're looking at here as we look at these passages, where he says, in that day the Lord with his sore and great and strong sword, this is 27:1, shall punish Leviathan, the pagan powers, the dinosaurs, spiritual dinosaurs of the world, the piercing serpent, even Leviathan, that crooked serpent. He's talking about the effects of Satan and the devil on the world, and shall slay the dragon that is in the sea. The dragon that is in the sea, the evil urges which are among all the peoples of the world. Once again, and this time he's not destroying it with a flood, he's destroying it with the word of truth, because this passage actually is looking forward to the coming of the Messiah and the coming of the Christian age. And he talks about it, and he says, I do keep it. I will water it every moment, lest any hurt it, and I will keep it day and night. That's exactly why he's putting these people in exile in first Assyria and then Babylon, because he is doing just exactly that. He's nurturing, he's protecting, he's watering the seed. And when we talk about that, we're talking about the seed line of Jesus Christ and the holy seed of the Father, of the Son of the Father. And so he says, at that, I'm done. He says, fury's not in me. And he says, who would set the briars and thorns against me in battle? I would go through them, I would burn them together, or let him take hold of my strength, that he may make peace with me. And he shall make peace with me. And he shall cause them that come of Jacob to take root. Israel shall blossom and bud and fill the face of the world with fruit. Remember in Matthew 24, you recall that they asked him about this, the end of things, and they asked it in such a way that they wanted to know about how would we know when the second coming was coming? How would we know when they talked about the temple, they talked about the destruction of Jerusalem, but they asked him that question, and Christ answered in a twofold fashion. He answered with what's going to happen to Jerusalem, and he was talking about AD 70. But then he looked down the road again in that day when he talked about the second coming of Christ, and he said of these days and of that day, two things completely separate. We're looking at the same principle being applied here. He's jumped forward to the coming of the Christian era, and now he's jumped back again to the restoration of that remnant from Israel back to Judea so that the seed line can be perpetuated. And so he asks, has he, and this is a sort of a rhetorical, but there's a promise there, okay? He says, is it really as bad as you think it's going to be? Is this really the end for you, or is this just a way for us to start over? Okay, so let's read verses 7 through 9. Someone read for me Isaiah 27, 7 through 9.
Has he struck Israel as he struck those who struck him? Or has he been slain according to the slaughter of those who were slain by him? In measure by sending it away, you contend with it. He removed it by his rough wind in the day of the east wind. Therefore, by this iniquity of Jacob will be recovered, and this is all the fruit of taking away his sin. when he makes all the stones of the altar like the chalk stones that are beaten to dust. Wooden images, incest altars shall not stand.
Okay, so now he's talking about a number of things there. The first verse is a rhetorical question. Is it really the end, or is just a step toward a new beginning here? He says, is the slain according to the slaughter of them that are slain by him? Or is Israel going to be destroyed utterly like all of God's other enemies? And the answer to that question is no. So that's why that is a rhetorical question. It might seem that it was a certainty to those people who were being slaughtered by the Babylonians and taken into captivity and dragged into exile by the Babylonians. They might have thought that it was the end of the world. But Isaiah told them that was not the case. And had they listened for the most part, they would have understood that. But God says that in measure when it shooteth forth, thou wilt debate with it. You will contend with it. But he said, so you will deal with these issues while you're in captivity. But he says, he stayeth his rough wind in the day of the east wind. He's talking about the rough wind being God's wrath, and God staying his wrath in the shape, in the form of the east wind. And by that east wind, we're talking about, here's Babylon, here's Medo-Persia. Let me see if I do this. Here's Babylon, here's Medo-Persia. As you look at me, relatively, that is the east wind sweeping up to take over Babylon. And of course, we know that under Cyrus and under Darius, Babylon was overthrown, and those people were those captives. That remnant was returned by declaration or edict of Cyrus to restore the temple. And so that's an allusion to the part in God's plan that the Medo-Persians play. And he says, therefore by this shall the iniquity of Jacob be purged. He's talking about the fact that they are going to learn the errors of their way, never to worship idols again, to do things God's way, and the remnant that come back will remain faithful in that regard. In that regard. Perhaps not in other regards, but in that regard they will, because he says he maketh all the stones of the altar. He's talking about the pagan altars, the altars to false gods, as chalk stones that are beaten in sunder. They're going to be leveled. Never again will there be idol worship going on in Judea. All right? Not formal idol worship for sure. That are beaten in sunder, the groves and the images shall not stand up. So there's good images there. There's an image of relief. But as has often happened in their history, particularly in that history of the judges, they were oppressed, they were set upon, they cried out, they were delivered, they rejoiced, and they got complacent again. So that cycle of up and down, so that God had to punish them again. So lest they be brought to life, lest they be heartened by this, and they should be heartened by this. But he says, but you're going to be saved, but you're not going to be saved right now. That's going to be 70 years hence. Okay? But right now, you need to know that this is going to happen. And so he goes back and says, don't let this good prophecy temper the fact that you've still got to pay your due. All right. So now let's go ahead and read through. Go ahead and read through verse 13, please.
Lord shall feed off from the channel of the river unto the stream of Egypt, and he shall be carried one by one of the children of Israel. And it shall come to pass in that day that the great trumpet shall be blown, and they shall come which were ready to perish in the land of Assyria, and the outcasts in the land of Egypt, and shall worship the Lord in the holy mount at Jerusalem.
Okay, so that he's talking about that gathering of the remnant. He's also in verse 10, he's saying, just remember that before this happens, the defense city, he's talking about Jerusalem now, the defense city, on Mount Zion, shall be desolate, shall be leveled, which is what the Babylonians did. They leveled that city, okay? And so that will be left like a wilderness, and there shall the calf feed. Now, calf is not what you're talking about, what you're thinking of, a domestic calves feeding there. He's talking about a fact that it is so open and so torn down that the grass grows up and the wild animals graze where once there was a mighty city. So we're talking about a leveling and the walls broken down and animals coming in and overtaking it. All right. And so he says, they will lie down, they will consume the branches thereof. That could easily be wild goats, they eat branches and stuff too. So and when the boughs thereof are withered, they shall be broken off, and women come and set them on fire. Remember that there are still those people that are considered to be of no use to the Babylonians, and they are cast off, and they will be gathering the sticks and gathering wood to burn out of the rubble of the city and out of the area around it, okay, which would normally have been clean and well kept. And he's talking about things like the vineyards and the fruit trees, which will have died down and will be broken off and dried and broken off. And instead of getting fruit off of them, they will simply break the branches and make cook fires so that they can eat what little they have. All right. Therefore, he that made them will not have mercy on them, and he that formed them will show them no favor. And there, we're talking about that period of time where the land is enjoying its Sabbaths, if you will, because the people have been removed from it, except for a small remnant. Just enough to keep the countryside itself from being completely grown over and wild. All right? And then he says, it shall come to pass in that day that the Lord shall beat off from the channel of the river unto the stream of Egypt, and you shall be gathered one by one, ye children of Israel. Remnant gathered. And one by one, I think about that, and will they be gathered together one by one? They'll be asked for volunteers to return, okay? But here's another thing about one by one. How do we win back souls? Remember that the Jews, I feel like this is an allusion to Christianity, because remember that the Jews were classified as Jews through this process of circumcision, and they were a Jew by birth. So there was no need to teach them. They taught them from children, but there was no need to gather them one by one in terms of Christianity, where we have to teach Christianity and we gather, we teach and preach one and save one soul at a time. That's how we do it. Each one reach one. We do it to the best of our ability, but we don't do it en masse. We don't say you're all automatically Christians. That's not the way it works. Now, they could say we're children of Abraham. But remember, under John, and then again under Christ, and then again under the apostles, they said a circumcision made of hands does not define the new Israel. And so I think there's a look forward to this at this particular time. And he says, it shall come to pass in verse 13, in that day the great trumpet shall be blown, and they shall come which were ready to perish in the land of Assyria, and outcasts in the land of Egypt, and shall worship the Lord in the holy mount of Israel. And he is definitely alluding to the restoration there. But again, you can see a twofold allusion there, a twofold a twofold prophecy for the gathering of all the peoples together, where the word shall go forth from Mount Zion. And he's talking, and when I say that, I'm talking about Daniel's prophecy of the seed of Christianity at that particular time. But he's also saying that the Assyrians, those who are, and the Assyrians in this point, remember, this could be a twofold, again, talking about the Assyrians, the captives in Assyria, but also remember that Assyria had also repopulated that area of Israel down through Palestine. And so those Assyrians would also, we're talking basically about the Sumerians at this particular point, who were of dual blood, if you will. They were half bloods, and which was tempting for the Israelites or for the Judeans to look down upon them, and of course that was a lesson that they had to learn the hard way as well. But we're talking about captivity, and remember, when he talks about outcasts in the land of Egypt, remember that Jeremiah, there was a remnant that fled Babylon and a remnant that fled Assyria, crossed over, they call it the river of Egypt, which isn't really a river, it's sort of a wadi that runs water in the wet season, the rainy season. But basically what he says is they headed south and they entered into Egypt territory. And there was in fact a large Jewish enclave in Egypt, and they found archaeological evidence of this with Jewish manuscripts in Egypt, where these people had been while they waited for God's wrath to be fulfilled against Israel and against Judea. So he's referring to those refugees, Jewish refugees in Egypt, who would then, when they got word, return. All right. Now it's interesting to note that they still had family ties in Egypt, because remember that when Herod tried to destroy Jesus, that the angels came and told Joseph, pick your family up and go to Egypt with him. And so he went south to Egypt and to the Jewish community, which remained there even after the repatriation of Judea. Okay? We're talking about having remained in Egypt for a period of time spanning some 400 years of the intertestamental period. All right? And so he goes back to the woes, the prophecies of disaster against those people who helped the invaders, who clapped their hands in joy when Israel was beset, because they said, yeah, they've got it coming. And so there's a comparison here of Assyria, and it's being, and we're talking about Assyria here now, the hailstorms and the floods. This is all apocalyptic language, where we're talking about them being overwhelmed. Remember that Assyria was overwhelmed by Babylon, and then Babylon in turn was overwhelmed by the Medo-Persians, who again later on fell in defeat to the Greeks, who then lost their influence to the Romans as well. All right. So we're talking about that. Daniel's colossal figure, when we're talking about this, we're talking about a picture, a prophecy of the different civilizations that were built upon each other and set the stage for Christianity, which surpassed all national boundaries in the process of its spread. So let's take a look at this woe to Ephraim, and go ahead and read the first four verses. First four verses.
Woe to the crown of pride, to the drunkards of Ephraim, whose glorious beauty is a fading flower, which is at the head of verdant valleys, to those who are overcome with wine. Behold, the Lord has a mighty and strong one, like a tempest of hail and a destroying storm, like a flood of mighty waters overflowing. Who will bring them down to the earth with his hand? The crown of pride, the drunkards of Ephraim, will be trampled underfoot, and the glorious beauty is a fading flower, which is at the head of the verdant valley, like the first fruit before the summer, which an observer sees. He eats it up while it is still in his hand.
Okay, so he's talking about a comparison. A comparison here, because he used the same language to describe Assyria, but he's talking about this comparison of the invading Babylonians and how they seem like the Assyrians did. They came as a storm, as a flood, as overflowing of mighty waters, and overtook the earth. And so Ephraim, characterized by their pride, by their spiritual excess, if you will, their excess, their idol worship, and their excesses in their ceremonies that were going to be trodden under feet. And the head of the fat valley, that opening where the river opens up into the valley of the fatness, which when the rains come, the flood comes, and everything gets washed away. So we're talking about comparing the coming of these invaders as a flood, a storm flood, a rushing flood that sweeps everything from its path. Which when he that looketh upon it seeth while it is yet in his hand, he eateth it up. So he's saying that it's going to come so fast that they'll be sitting there, standing there, preparing to eat their food, and the invader will literally snatch their food from their hand and eat it themselves. In the face of harvest, in the face of plenty, they will be desolate. And then he talks about the result of that oppression. And the fact that those who are left will be grateful to God. For how long? We don't know for sure. Let's go ahead and read verses 5 through 8. Verses 5 through 8.
In the day the Lord of hosts will be for a crown of glory, and a diadem of beauty, and the remnant of his people. For the spirit of justice to him who sits in judgment, and for the strength of those who turn back to battle at the gate. But they also have erred through wine, and through intoxicating drink are out of the way. The priest and the prophet have erred through intoxicating drink. They are allowed up by wine. They are out of the way through intoxicating drink. They err in vision, and they stumble in judgment. For all tables are full of vomit and filth. No place is clean.
Okay, so it's a pretty unsavory image here. He's talking about the fact that in that day, the glory of the host for a crown of glory, for a diadem of beauty, unto the residue of his people. The people who are brought back will be grateful. And for a spirit of judgment to him that sitteth in judgment, and for strength to them that turn the battle to the gate, that turn things around and come back in again. Okay? So we're talking about that remnant. But again, he pivots from a commendation for those who will learn their lesson and pivots back to what put them there in the first place, where he says they also have erred through strong wine. He's talking about, but they also, that they will remember their mistakes as they come back and will learn from them, because they will understand that they've erred through wine, through strong drink, and are out of the way, have walked away from God. Okay? The priest and the prophet likewise have led them away from God. And they err in vision, they stumble in judgment, because they are drunk on excess, spiritual excess. Okay? All the tables, that's a bad image of a drunken party where people have eaten and consumed their full and purged themselves and gone back and eaten again, so that the image there is of excess to the point where there's nothing left over but people lying around in a terrible mess. Okay, nobody able to stand up, nobody even willing to stand up and go, oh man, we got to clean this up. Okay. Whom shall he teach knowledge? Verse 9. Whom shall he make to understand doctrine? Them that are weaned from the milk and drawn from the breast. So he's saying that this is a forcible, he's taken them into, he's talking about the fact that excess that made them complacent, that made them cocky, that made them walk away from God, they're going to be stripped of that. He's talking about the rehabilitative effect of being in Assyria and in Babylon and suffering to the point where they learned that they must turn to the God that had protected them, that they have walked away from, and so he has allowed this to happen. So it's a forceful weaning from all those things, the worldly things in their land that had diverted their attention away from the worship of God. That's the weaning we're talking about here. Putting them in a place where they are forced to face their own mistakes and learn from them. So let's go ahead and read verse 10 through 13. 10 through 13.
For precept must be upon precept, precept upon precept, line upon line, line upon line, here a little, there a little. With the stammering lips and another tongue, he will speak to his people, to whom he said, This is the rest with which you may cause the weary to rest, and this is the refreshing, yet they would not hear. But the word of the Lord was to them, precept upon precept, precept upon precept, line upon line, line upon line, here a little, there a little, that they may go and fall backward and be broken and snared and caught.
Okay, broken and snared and taken. So book, chapter, and verse. We're talking about the fact that the prophets spoke to Israel and spoke to Judea, citing book, chapter, and verse. Each little piece that they should put together to form the basis of their faith. Building an undeniable argument in favor of God's plan. You know, that's how Paul did it. Book, chapter, and verse, line by line, little by little is what we're saying here. And so they had no reason to deny, had they set their minds to what God was telling them, that to deny him and to walk away from him. But remember that when God's word is preached, it either softens the heart, breaks the heart, or hardens the heart, as it hardened Pharaoh's heart, as it hardened Herod's heart. Okay, as it hardened the hearts of those Jews who crucified Christ. As in fact, it hardens many people's hearts from time to time. But their response, you preach the word, and people condemn themselves by the way they respond. So they had a choice. God warned them over and over and over and said, yet again, you can still be saved if you'll just turn to me. But he reached a point where he said, that's enough. That's all she wrote. And so he talks about stammering lips and another tongue. Well, he's talking about the language of the Babylonians, okay? Using a different tongue. It was an older tongue. It was an Akkadian tongue. It was a tongue that preceded, it was a tongue that really upon which the language of Abraham was based. And they used that language, and in fact, parts of Daniel were actually not in Hebrew or Aramaic, but they were in that Akkadian language. They're the pre-runners of the forerunners of the Babylonians. A legal language, just like Koine Greek was used because it did not change. It was a dead language. Well, this language was also a forerunner, a dead language, if you will. All right. But it was used for legal purposes because it would never change. So they had scholars who were trained in that language. And apparently Daniel had enough of a knowledge of it that many of the things which he recorded were recorded in that legal language and then translated later on. All right? So we're talking about a foreign tongue here. As an aside here, we remember that Greeks, when Paul spoke to the Greeks and the barbarians, he spoke to the Greeks who spoke Greek, and to everyone else the Greeks called barbarians because their language was strange to them. When they spoke, it was like bar, 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 and that's why they called them barbarians. All right, because it was a language that it was kind of a demeaning thing. You know, there's Greek, and then there's everything else. All right, and so we see that he talks about the language of the Babylonians, the language of the of the forerunners, the legal language, which again would be recorded. And so then he calls them to pay attention because these people had been brought down because they would not listen to book, chapter, and verse. They would not accumulate and bring this knowledge and this teaching on board and accept it with their mind. They would not reason together that their sins would be cleansed. And so verse 14 says that this is why you have to pay attention. So let's read 14. Let's read 14 through 18, please.
Wherefore hear the word of the Lord, these scornful men, that rule this people which is in Jerusalem, because ye have said, we have made a covenant with the dead, and with him are we in agreement. When the overflowing scourge shall pass through, it shall not come unto us. For we have made lies our refuge, and under falsehood have we hid ourselves. Therefore, thus saith the Lord God, behold, I lay in Zion for a foundation, a stone, a tried stone, a precious cornerstone, a sure foundation. He that believeth shall not haste. Judgment also will I say to the cloud, and the righteousness to the fire. And the nail shall sweep away the refuge of lies, and the water shall overflow the hiding place. And your covenant which did shall be disannulled, and your agreement with hell shall not stand. When the overflowing scourge shall pass through, then we shall be trodden down by it.
Okay, so this is an interesting vision here because you see a lot of imagery from things which were done in those days. He said, because you have said we've made a covenant with death and with hell, we are at agreement, because they had made, they thought in their minds that they had made some sort of a pact which was based upon lies, okay? And when those lies were found out, then again, when they in turn rebelled against the Babylonians, that second time, the Babylonians said, well, that's enough. And so they came and wiped them out. When the overflowing scourge shall pass through it, it shall not come unto us. That feeling that they could somehow escape judgment. Those people who were so righteous that they thought, well, here's what we're going to do. We're going to try to escape. They snuck through the walls of the besieged city of Jerusalem and ran, thinking that either they could escape or they could, when they got caught, they could surrender. And when they got caught, that surrender was far from anybody's mind at that point in time. And once they got caught, they paid the price ultimately as well, because they had abandoned their people. They had lied to their people and said, we're all going to be safe as long as we stay in the walls. And then they escaped or tried to. Therefore, thus says the Lord. Now he looks ahead and he says, you are, as a nation, you are now going to be lost. But you're going to come back because, again, my plan will be fulfilled. So he looks at their sense of loss and then he wheels right back around again. And he looks down the road at the religion which will overwhelm all nations. Christianity. So he says, behold, I lay in Zion a stone for foundation, a tried stone, a precious cornerstone. We've heard this before. We've heard it referred to in the Psalms. We've heard it referred to in Matthew. We've heard it referred to in Romans and Corinthians and Ephesians. That imagery where Paul would seek to invoke the memories of messianic prophecy from Isaiah in the minds of those people so that they would understand that Jesus was the one whom Isaiah was talking about. All right? So he said, judgment also will I lay to the line. Lay to the line. First off, he says, a sure foundation, a cornerstone, that Jesus Christ is the Son of the living God, that good confession that Peter made on the coast of Caesarea, upon which Jesus said he would build his church, that Christ is the Son of the living God, that he is the Messiah, okay? And he says, then I will lay judgment also will I lay to the line and righteousness to the plummet. We're talking, when we talk about the line, when we talk about the plummet, we're talking about the fact that a punishment was exacted for rebellion. And so they basically had everybody line up, and the man flipped the coin. He drew a line straight down the row, and he flipped the coin, and whichever side the coin fell on, one half, everybody on this side of the line was executed. The plumb line, the plummet, as you will, okay? Well, God draws that line. And it's interesting to note that there's a reference being made here to the choices that people make, because that plumb line, the tried stone, the cornerstone, the foundation, the stumbling block, the rock of offense. These people, judgment will be laid to the line, and the hail shall sweep away the refuge of lies, and the water shall overflow the hiding place. And those who had made that covenant with death would be disannulled, and their agreement with hell would not stand. And he's talking about basically this putting away, setting aside of Hebrew law in place of a law which did not classify you according to your blood, but according to your heart. And people, instead of drawing that line, people had the choice of deciding which line they would stand on. And on Judgment Day, instead of the line being right down the middle, it's going to be way over here. And we better hope we're on that side. We better do everything we can to make sure that we're on that side. That's probably a good place for us to stop. We'll stop at verse 19. Isaiah 28, verse 19, and we'll take that up next Sunday morning. Are there questions at this time? If not, let's take a break. We'll meet back at the top of the hour. Thank you all for your attention.
Thank you for joining us for Sunday morning Bible study, Isaiah 27:7. Please join us again at 11 o'clock where we will be studying Christian Call for Change. See you at 11.